me to perfect my recent treatise upon the disuse of the comma are quite equal to impromptu experimentation in the field of psychic phenomena. I was aware that the young people themselves hardly expected serious acquiescence, and that, too, stimulated me. I cleared my throat in a prefatory manner, and silence fell upon the group. A light breeze had risen outside, and the timbers of the barn creaked persistently. From the shadows almost directly overhead there came a faint clanking. It was evidently caused by the rusty pulley wheel which I had observed there as we entered. An iron hook at the end of an ancient rope still depended from it, and swung in the lightly stirring air several feet above our heads, directly over the center of our circle. Some curious combination of influences, perhaps the atmosphere of the place, added to the stimulation of the faintly discernible faces around me, and my impulse to prove my own ability in this untried field of narration, gave me a sudden sense of being inspired. I found myself voicing fancies as though they were facts, and readily including imaginary names and data which certainly were not in any way premeditated. "This barn stands on the old Creed place," I began. "Peter Creed was its last owner, but I suppose that it has always been and always will be known as the Turner Barn. A few yards away to the south you will find the crumbling brickwork and gaping hollows of an old foundation, now overgrown with weeds that almost conceal a few charred timbers. That is all that is left of the old Ashley Turner house." I cleared my throat again, not through any effort to gain time for my thoughts, but to feel for a moment the satisfaction arising from the intent attitude of my audience, particularly my wife, who had leaned forward and was looking at me with an expression of startled surprise. "Ashley Turner must have had a pretty fine-looking farm here 30 years or so ago," I continued, "when he brought his wife to it. This barn was new then. But he was a ne'er-do-well, with nothing to be said in his favor, unless you admit his fame as a practical joker. Strange how the ne'er-do-well is often equipped with an extravagant sense of humor. Turner had a considerable retinue among the riffraff boys of the neighborhood, who made this barn a noisy rendezvous and followed his hints in much whimsical mischief. But he committed most of his practical jokes when drunk, and in his sober moments he abused his family and let his wife struggle to keep up the acres, assisted only by a half-competent man of all work. Finally he took to roving. No one knew how he got pocket money, his wife could not have given him any. Then someone discovered that he was going over to Creed's now and then, and everything was explained. This concise data of mine was evidently not holding the close attention of my youthful audience. They annoyed me by frequent pranks and whisperings. No one could have been more surprised at my glibness than I myself, except perhaps my wife, whose attitude of strained attention had not relaxed. I resumed my story. Peter Creed was a good old-fashioned usurer of the worst type. He went to church regularly one day in the week and gouged his neighbors, any that he could get into his clutches, on the other 6. He must have been lending Turner drinking money, and everyone knew what the security must be. At last there came a day when the long-suffering wife revolted. Turner had come home extra drunk and in his most maudlin humor. Probably he attempted some drunken prank upon his overtaxed helpmate. Old Ike, the hired man, said that he thought Turner had rigged up some scare for her in the barn and that he had never heard anything so much like straight talking from his mistress, either before or since, and he was working in the woodshed at the time, with the door shut. Shortly after that tirade Ashley Turner disappeared, and no one saw or heard of him or thought about him for a couple of years except when the sight of his tired-looking wife and scrawny children revived the recollection. At last, on a certain autumn day, old Peter Creed turned up here at the Turner place. I imagine Mrs. Turner knew what was in store for her when his rusty buggy came in sight around the corner of the barn. At any rate, she made no protest, and listened meekly to his curt statement that he held an overdue mortgage, with plenty of back interest owing, and it was time for her to go. She went. Neither she nor anyone else doubted Creed's rights in the matter, and, after all, I believe it got a better home for her somewhere in the long run. I paused here in my narration to draw breath and readjust my leg, which had become cramped. There was a general readjustment and shifting of position, with some levity. It was darker now. The rafters above us were invisible, and the faces about me looked oddly white against the shadowy background. After a moment or two of delay I cleared my throat sharply and continued. Old Creed came thus into possession of this place, just as he had come to own a dozen others in the county. He usually lived on one until he was able to sell it at a good profit over his investment, so he settled down in the Turner house, and kept old Ike because he worked for little or nothing. But he seemed to have a hard time finding a purchaser. It must have been about a year later when an unexpected thing happened. Creed had come out here to the barn to lock up. He always did that himself, when he noticed something unusual about the haymow. This haymow, which stood then about 6 feet above the barn floor. He looked closer through the dusk, and saw a pair of boots, went nearer, and found that they were fitted to a pair of human legs whose owner was sound asleep in his hay. Creed picked up a short stick and beat on one boot. "Get out of here," he said, "or I'll have you locked up." The sleeper woke in slow fashion, sat up, grinned, and said, "Hello, Peter Creed." It was Ashley Turner, beyond question. Creed stepped back a pace or two and seemed at a loss for words. An object slipped from Turner's pocket as he moved, slid along the hay, and fell to the barn floor. It was a half-filled whiskey flask. No one knows full details of the conversation that ensued, of course. Such little as I am able to tell you of what was said and done comes through old Ike, who watched from a safe distance outside the barn, ready to act at a moment's notice as best suited his own safety and welfare. Of one thing Ike was certain: Creed lacked his usual browbeating manner. He was apparently struggling to assume an unwanted friendliness. Turner was very drunk, but triumphant, and his satisfaction over what he must have felt was the practical joke of his life seemed to make him friendly. I kept 'em all right, he said again and again. I've got the proof. I wasn't working for nothing all these months. I ain't fool enough yet to throw away papers even when I'm drunk. To the watchful Ike's astonishment, Creed evidently tried to persuade him to come into the house for something to eat. Turner slid off the haymow, found his steps too unsteady, laughed foolishly, and suggested that Creed bring some food to him there. Guess I've got a right to sleep in the barn or house, whichever I want, he said, leering into Creed's face. The old usurer stood there for a few minutes eyeing Turner thoughtfully. Then he actually gave him a shoulder back onto the hay, said something about finding a snack of supper, and started out of the barn. In the doorway he turned, looked back, then walked over to the edge of the mow and groped on the floor until he found the whiskey flask, picked it up, tossed it into Turner's lap, and stumbled out of the barn again. I was becoming interested in my own story and somewhat pleased with the fluency of it, but my audience annoyed me. There was intermittent whispering, with some laughter, and I inferred that one or another would occasionally stimulate this inattention by tickling a companion with a straw. Miss Armstrong, who is so frivolous by nature that I sometimes question her right to a place in my classroom, I even suspected of irritating the back of my own neck in the same fashion. Naturally, I ignored it. Peter Creed, I repeated, went into the house. I hung around the barn, waiting. He was frankly curious. In a few minutes his employer reappeared, carrying a plate heaped with an assortment of scraps. Ike peered and listened, then without compunction. "It's the best I've got," he heard Creed say grudgingly. Turner's tones were now more drunkenly belligerent. "It had better be," he said loudly. "And I'll take the best bed after tonight." Evidently he was eating and muttering between mouthfuls. "You might have brought me another bottle." "I did," said Creed, to the listening Ike's great astonishment. Turner laughed immoderately. A long silence followed. Turner was either eating or drinking. Then he spoke again, more thickly and drowsily. "Damn unpleasant, that rope. Why don't you haul it up out of my way?" "It don't hurt you any," said Creed. "Don't you wish it would?" said Turner, with drunken shrewdness. "But I don't like it." "Haul it away." "I will," said Creed. There was a longer silence, and then there came an intermittent rasping sound. A moment later Creed came suddenly from the barn. Ike fumbled with a large rake, and made as though to hang it on its accustomed peg near the barn door. Creed eyed him sharply. "Get along to bed," he ordered, and Ike obeyed. That was a Saturday night. On Sunday morning Ike went to the barn later than usual and hesitatingly. Even then he was first to enter. He found the drunkard's body hanging here over the mow, just about where we are sitting, stark and cold. It was a gruesome end to a miserable homecoming. My audience was quiet enough now. Miss Armstrong and one or two others giggled loudly, but it was obviously forced, and found no further echo. The breeze which had sprung up some time before was producing strange creakings and raspings in the old timbers, and the pulley wheel far above us clanked with a dismal repetitious sound, like the tolling of a cracked bell. I waited a moment, well satisfied with the effect, and then continued. The coroner's jury found it suicide, though some shook their heads meaningly. Turner had apparently sobered up enough to stand, and, making a simple loop around his neck by catching the rope through its own hook, had then slid off the mow. The rope which went over the pulley wheel up there in the roof ran out through a window under the eaves, and was made fast near the barn door outside, where anyone could haul on it. Creed testified the knot was one he had tied many days before. Ike was a timorous old man, with a wholesome fear of his employer, and he supported the testimony and made no reference to his eavesdropping of the previous evening, though he heard Creed swear before the jury that he did not recognize the tramp he had fed and lodged. There were no papers in Turner's pockets, only a few coins, and a marked pocket knife that gave the first clue to his identity. A few of the neighbors said that it was a fitting end, and that the verdict was a just one. Nevertheless, whisperings began and increased. People avoided Creed and the neighborhood. Rumors grew that the barn was haunted. Passers-by on the road after dark said they heard the old pulley wheel clanking when no breeze stirred, much as you hear it now. Some claim to have heard maudlin laughter. Possible purchasers were frightened away, and Creed grew more and more solitary and misanthropic. Old Ike hung on, heaven knows why, though I suppose Creed paid him some sort of wage. Rumors grew. Folks said that neither Ike nor Creed entered this barn after a time, and no hay was put in, though Creed would not have been Creed if he had not sold off the bulk of what he had, ghost or no ghost. I can imagine him slowly forking it out alone, daytimes, and the amount of hay still here proves that even he finally lost courage. I paused a moment, but though there was much uneasy stirring about, and the dismal clanking directly above us was incessant, no one of my audience spoke. It was wholly dark now, and I think all had drawn closer together. About 10 years ago people began calling Creed crazy. Here I was forced to interrupt my own story. I shall have to ask you, Miss Arnstell, to stop annoying me. I have been aware for some moments that you are brushing my head with a straw, but I have ignored it for the sake of the others. Out of the darkness came Miss Arnstell's voice, protesting earnestly, and I realized from the direction of the sound that in the general readjustment she must have settled down in the very center of our circle, and could not be the one at fault. One of the others was childish enough to simulate a mocking burst of raucous laughter, but I chose to ignore it. Very well, said I, graciously, shall I go on? Go on, echoed a subdued chorus. It was the night of the 28th of May, 10 years ago, not the 28th, broke in my wife's voice, sharply, that is today's date. There was a note in her voice that I hardly recognized, but it indicated that she was in some way affected by my narration, and I felt a distinct sense of triumph. It was the night of May 28th, I repeated firmly. Are you making up this story, my wife's voice continued, still with the same odd tone. I am, my dear, and you are interrupting it. But an Ashley Turner and later a Peter Creed owned this place, she persisted almost in a whisper, and I am sure you never heard of them. I confess that I might wisely have broken off my story then and called for a light. There had been an hysterical note in my wife's voice, and I was startled at her words, for I had no conscious recollection of either name, yet I felt a resultant exhilaration. Our lanterns had grown strangely dim, though I was certain both had been recently trimmed and filled, and from their far corner of the barn they threw no light whatever into our circle. I faced an utter blackness. On that night, said I, old Ike was wakened by sounds as of someone fumbling to unbar and open the housey door. It was an unwonted hour, and he peered from the window of his little room. By the dim starlight, it was just before dawn, he could see all of the open yard and roadway before the house, with the great barn looming like a black and sinister shadow as its farther barrier. Crossing this space, he saw the figure of Peter Creed, grotesquely stooped and old in the obscuring gloom, moving slowly, almost gropingly, and yet directly, as though impelled, toward the barn's overwhelming shadow. Slowly he unbarred the great door, swung it open, and entered the blacker shadows it concealed. The door closed after him. Ike in his secure post of observation did not stir. He could not. Even to his crude imagining there was something utterly horrible in the thought of Creed alone at that hour in just such black darkness as this, with the great timbered chamber haunted at least by its dread memories. He could only wait, tense and fearful of he knew not what. A shriek that pierced the silence relaxed his tension, bringing almost a sense of relief, so definite had been his expectancy. But it was a burst of shrill laughter, ribald, uncanny, undeniable, accompanying the shriek that gave him power of motion. He ran half-naked 1/4 mile to the nearest neighbors and told his story. They found Creed hanging, the rope hooked simply around his neck. It was a silent jury that filed from the barn that morning after viewing the body. Suicide, said they, after Ike, shivering and stammering, had testified, harking back to the untold evidence of that other morning years before. Yes, Creed was dead, with a terrible look on his wizen face, and the dusty old rope ran through its pulley wheel and was fast to a beam high above. He must have climbed to the beam, made the rope fast, and jumped, said the foreman, solemnly. He must have, repeated the man, parrot-like, while the sweat stood out on his forehead, because there wasn't no other way, but as God is my judge, the knot in the rope and the dust on the beam ain't been disturbed for years. At this dramatic climax there was an audible sigh from my audience. I sat quietly for a time, content to allow the silence and the atmosphere of the place, which actually seemed surcharged with influences not of my creation, to add to the effect my story had caused. There was scarcely a movement in our circle, of that I felt sure. And yet once more, out of the almost tangible darkness above me, something seemed to reach down and brush against my head. A slight motion of air, sufficient to disturb my rather scanty locks, was additional proof that I was the butt of some prank that had just missed its objective. Then, with a fearful suddenness, close to my ear burst a shrill discord of laughter, so uncanny and so unlike the usual sound of student merriment that I started up, half wondering if I had heard it. Almost immediately after it the heavy darkness was torn again by a shriek so terrible in its intensity as completely to differentiate it from the other cries which followed. "Bring a light," cried a voice that I recognized as that of my wife, though strangely distorted by emotion. There was a great confusion. Young women struggled from their places and impeded one another in the darkness, but finally, and it seemed an unbearable delay, someone brought a single lantern. Its frail light revealed Miss Armstell half upright from her place in the center of our circle, my wife's arms sustaining her weight. Her face, as well as I could see it, seemed darkened and distorted, and when we forced her clutching hands away from her bare throat we could see, even in that light, the marks of an angry, throttling scar entirely encircling it. Just above her head the old pulley rope swayed menacingly in the faint breeze. My recollection is even now confused as to the following moments and our stumbling escape from that gruesome spot. Miss Armstell is now at her home, recovering from what her physician calls mental shock. My wife will not speak of it. The questions I would ask her are checked on my lips by the look of utter terror in her eyes. As I have confessed to you, my own philosophy is hard put to it to withstand not so much the community attitude toward what they are pleased to call my taste in practical joking, but to assemble and adjust the facts of my experience. A Shady Plot by Elsie Brown. This story was submitted as a class exercise in one of my short story classes at Columbia University. At my request the author, Elsie Brown, contributed it to this volume. A Shady Plot by Elsie Brown. So I sat down to write a ghost story. Jenkins was responsible. "Hullock," he had said to me, "give us another on the supernatural this time. Something to give them the horrors, that's what the public wants, and your ghosts are live propositions." Well, I was in no position to contradict Jenkins, for, as yet, his magazine had been the only one to print my stuff. So I had said, precisely, in the deepest voice I was capable of, and had gone out. I hadn't the shade of an idea, but at the time that didn't worry me in the least. You see, I had often been like that before and in the end things had always come my way, I didn't in the least know how or why. It had all been rather mysterious. You understand, I didn't specialize in ghost stories, but more or less they seemed to specialize in me. A ghost story had been the first fiction I had written. Curious how that idea for a plot had come to me out of nowhere after I had chased inspiration in vain for months. Even now, whenever Jenkins wanted a ghost, he called on me. And I had never found it healthy to contradict Jenkins. Jenkins always seemed to have an uncanny knowledge as to when the landlord or the grocer were pestering me, and he dunned me for a ghost. And somehow I'd always been able to dig one up for him, so I'd begun to get a bit cocky as to my ability. So I went home and sat down before my desk and sucked at the end of my pencil and waited, but nothing happened. Pretty soon my mind began to wander off on other things, decidedly unwholesome and material things, such as my wife's shopping and how on earth I was going to cure her of her alarming tendency to take every new fad that came along and work it to death. But I realized that would never get me any place, so I went back to staring at the ceiling. "This writing business is delightful, isn't it?" I said sarcastically at last, out loud, too. You see, I had reached the stage of imbecility when I was talking to myself. "Yes," said a voice at the other end of the room, "I should say it is." I admit I jumped. Then I looked around. It was twilight by this time and I had forgotten to turn on the lamp. The other end of the room was full of shadows and furniture. I sat staring at it and presently noticed something just taking shape. It was exactly like watching one of these moving picture cartoons being put together. First an arm came out, then a bit of sleeve of a stiff white shirtwaist, then a leg and a plaid skirt, until at last there she was complete, whoever she was. She was long and angular, with enormous fishy eyes behind big bone-rimmed spectacles, and her hair in a tight wad at the back of her head. Yes, I seemed able to see right through her head, and a jaw, well, it looked so solid that for the moment I began to doubt my very own senses and believe she was real after all. She came over and stood in front of me and glared, yes, positively glared down at me, although, to my knowledge, I had never laid eyes on the woman before, to say nothing of giving her cause to look at me like that. I sat still, feeling pretty helpless I can tell you, and at last she barked, "What are you gaping at?" I swallowed, though I hadn't been chewing anything. "Nothing," I said. "Absolutely nothing. My dear lady, I was merely waiting for you to tell me why you had come. And excuse me, but do you always come in sections like this? I should think your parts might get mixed up sometimes." "Didn't you send for me?" she crisped. Imagine how I felt at that. "Why, no, I don't seem to remember. Look here. Haven't you been calling on heaven and earth all afternoon to help you write a story?" I nodded, and then a possible explanation occurred to me and my spine got cold. Suppose this was the ghost of a stenographer applying for a job. I had had an advertisement in the paper recently. I opened my mouth to explain that the position was filled, and permanently so, but she stopped me. "And when I got back to the office from my last case and was ready for you, didn't you switch off to something else and sit there driveling so I couldn't attract your attention until just now?" I'm very sorry, really." "Well, you needn't be, because I just came to tell you to stop bothering us for assistance. You ain't going to get it. We're going on strike." "What?" "You don't have to yell at me." I didn't mean to yell," I said humbly. "But I'm afraid I didn't quite understand you. You said you were going on strike. Don't you know what a strike is?" Not another plot do you get from us. I stared at her and wet my lips. Is that where they've been coming from? Of course. Where else? But my ghosts aren't a bit like you. If they were, people wouldn't believe in them. She draped herself on the top of my desk among the pens and ink bottles and leaned towards me. In the other life I used to write. You did. She nodded. But that has nothing to do with my present form. It might have, but I gave it up at last for that very reason, and went to work as a reader on a magazine. She sighed, and rubbed the end of her long eagle nose with a reminiscent finger. Those were terrible days. The memory of them made me mistake purgatory for paradise, and at last when I attained my present state of being, I made up my mind that something should be done. I found others who had suffered similarly, and between us we organized the Writers' Inspiration Bureau. We scout around until we find a writer without ideas and with a mind soft enough to accept impression. The case is brought to the attention of the main office, and one of us assigned to it. When that case is finished, we bring in a report. But I never saw you before, and you wouldn't have this time if I hadn't come to announce the strike. Many a time I've leaned on your shoulder when you've thought you were thinking hard, I groaned, and clutched my hair. The very idea of that horrible scarecrow so much as touching me. And wouldn't my wife be shocked? I shivered. But she continued, that's at an end. We've been called out of our beds a little too often in recent years, and now we're through. But my dear madam, I assure you I have had nothing to do with that. I hope I'm properly grateful and all that, you see. Oh, it isn't you, she explained patronizingly. It's those Ouija board fanatics. There was a time when we had nothing much to occupy us and used to haunt a little on the side, purely for amusement, but not anymore. We've had to give up haunting almost entirely. We sit at a desk and answer questions now. And such questions. She shook her head hopelessly, and taking off her glasses wiped them, and put them back on her nose again. But what have I got to do with this? She gave me a pitying look and rose. You're to exert your influence. Get all your friends and acquaintances to stop using the Ouija board, and then we'll start helping you to write. But there was a footstep outside my door. John. Oh, John, called the voice of my wife. I waved my arms at the ghost with something of the motion of a beginner when learning to swim. Madam, I must ask you to leave, and at once. Consider the impression if you were seen here. The ghost nodded, and began, very sensibly, I thought, to demobilize and evaporate. First the brogans on her feet grew misty until I could see the floor through them, then the affection spread to her knees and gradually extended upward. By this time my wife was opening the door. Don't forget the strike, she repeated, while her lower jaw began to disintegrate, and as my Lavinia crossed the room to me the last vestige of her ear faded into space. John, why in the world are you sitting in the dark? Just thinking, my dear. Thinking, rubbish, You were talking out loud. I remained silent while she lit the lamps, thankful that her back was turned to me. When I am nervous or excited, there is a muscle in my face that starts to twitch, and this pulls up one corner of my mouth and gives the appearance of an idiotic grin. So far I had managed to conceal this affliction from Lavinia. You know, I bought the loveliest thing this afternoon. Everybody's wild over them. I remembered her craze for taking up new fads, and a premonitory chill crept up the back of my neck. It isn't, I began and stopped. I simply couldn't ask, the possibility was too horrible. You'd never guess in the world. It's the duckiest, darlingest Ouija board, and so cheap. I got it at a bargain sale. Why, what's the matter, John? I felt things slipping. Nothing, I said, and looked around for the ghost. Suppose she had lingered, and upon hearing what my wife had said should suddenly appear. Like all sensitive women, Lavinia was subject to hysterics. But you looked so funny. I always do when I'm interested, I gulped. But don't you think that was a foolish thing to buy? Foolish? Oh, John. Foolish. And after me getting it for you. For me? What do you mean? To help you write your stories. Why, for instance, suppose you wanted to write an historical novel. You wouldn't have to wear your eyes out over those musty old books in the public library. All you'd have to do would be to get out your Ouija and talk to Napoleon, or William the Conqueror, or Helen of Troy. Well, maybe not Helen, anyhow you'd have all the local color you'd need, and without a speck of trouble. And think how easy writing your short stories will be now. But Lavinia, you surely don't believe in Ouija boards. I don't know, John, they are awfully thrilling. She had seated herself on the arm of my chair and was looking dreamily across the room. I started and turned around. There was nothing there, and I sank back with relief. So far so good. Oh, certainly, they're thrilling all right. That's just it, they're a darn sight too thrilling. They're positively devilish. Now, Lavinia, you have plenty of sense, and I want you to get rid of that thing just as soon as you can. Take it back and get something else. My wife crossed her knees and stared at me through narrowed lids. John Hallock, she said distinctly. I don't propose to do anything of the kind. In the first place, they won't exchange things bought at a bargain sale, and in the second, if you aren't interested in the other world, I am. So there, and she slid down and walked from the room before I could think of a single thing to say. She walked very huffily. Well, it was like that all the rest of the evening. Just as soon as I mentioned Ouija boards, I felt things begin to cloud up, so I decided to let it go for the present, in the hope that she might be more reasonable later. After supper I had another try at the writing, but as my mind continued a perfect blank, I gave it up and went off to bed. The next day was Saturday, and it being near the end of the month and a particularly busy day, I left home early without seeing Lavinia. Understand, I haven't quite reached the point where I can give my whole time to writing, and being bookkeeper for a lumber company does help with the grocery bills and pay for Lavinia's fancy shopping. Friday had been a half holiday, and of course when I got back the work was piled up pretty high, so high, in fact, that ghosts and stories and everything else vanished in a perfect tangle of figures. When I got off the streetcar that evening my mind was still churning. I remember now that I noticed, even from the corner, how brightly the house was illuminated, but at the time that didn't mean anything to me. I recall as I went up the steps and opened the door I murmured, 9 times 9 is 81. And then Gladolia met me in the hall. Mr. O'Hallock, de Mrs. Shoti inks you's lost. She say she done phone you dis morning to be home early, but for the Lord's sake not to stop to argufy now, but get ready for the company and come on down. Some memory of a message given me by one of the clerks filtered back through my brain, but I had been hunting 3 lost receipts at the time, and had completely forgotten it. Company, I said stupidly. What company? De Mrs. Ouija board parity, said Gladolia, and rolling her eyes she disappeared in the direction of the kitchen. I must have gone upstairs and dressed and come down again, for I presently found myself standing in the dimly lighted lower hall wearing my second best suit and a fresh shirt and collar. But I have no recollections of the process. There was a great chattering coming from our little parlor and I went over to the half-opened door and peered through. The room was full of women, most of them elderly, whom I recognized as belonging to my wife's book club. They were sitting in couples, and between each couple was a Ouija board. The mournful squeak of the legs of the moving triangular things on which they rested their fingers filled the air and mixed in with the conversation. I looked around for the ghost with my heart sunk down to 0. What if Lavinia should see her and go mad before my eyes? And then my wife came and tapped me on the shoulder. "John," she said in her sweetest voice, and I noticed that her cheeks were very pink and her eyes very bright. My wife is never so pretty as when she's doing something she knows I disapprove of. "John, dear, I know you'll help us out." Mrs. William Augustus Wainwright phoned at the last moment to say that she couldn't possibly come, and that leaves poor Laura Hinkle without a partner. Now, John, I know some people can work a Ouija by themselves, but Laura can't, and she'll just have a horrible time unless you, me. I gasped. Me. I won't, but even as I spoke she had taken my arm, and the next thing I knew I was sitting with the thing on my knees and Miss Laura Hinkle opposite, grinning in my face like a flirtatious crocodile. I won't," I began. "Now, Mr. Hallock, don't you be shy." Miss Laura Hinkle leaned forward and shook a bony finger almost under my chin. I'm not. Only I say I won't. No, it's very easy, really. You just put the tips of your fingers right here beside the tips of my fingers, and the first thing I knew she had taken my hands and was coyly holding them in the position desired. She released them presently, and the little board began to slide around in an aimless sort of way. There seemed to be some force tugging it about. I looked at my partner, first with suspicion, and then with a vast relief. If she was doing it, then all that talk about spirits, oh, I did hope Miss Laura Hinkle was cheating with that board. Ouija, dear, won't you tell us something, she cooed, and on the instant the thing seemed to take life. It rushed to the upper left-hand corner of the board and hovered with its front leg on the word yes. Then it began to fly around so fast that I gave up any attempt to follow it. My companion was bending forward and had started to spell out loud, "Traitor, traitor." "Why, what does she mean?" "I don't know," I said desperately. My collar felt very tight. "But she must mean something." "Ouija, dear, won't you explain yourself more fully?" "Askhim. Ask him." "Ask who, Ouija?" I'm going." I choked and tried to get up, but my fingers seemed stuck to that dreadful board and I dropped back again. Apparently Miss Hinkle had not heard my protest. The thing was going around faster than ever and she was reading the message silently, with her brow corrugated, and the light of the huntress in her pale blue eyes. "Why, she says it's you, Mr. Hallock." "What does she mean?" "Ouija, won't you tell us who is talking?" I groaned, but that inexorable board continued to spell. I always did hate a spelling match. Miss Hinkle was again following it aloud, Helen Helen. She raised her voice until it could be heard at the other end of the room. "Lavinia, dear, do you know anyone by the name of Helen?" "By the name of?" "I can't hear you." And my wife made her way over to us between the book club's chairs. "You know the funniest thing has happened," she whispered excitedly. Someone had been trying to communicate with John through Mrs. Hunt's and Mrs. Sprinkle's Ouija. Someone by the name of Helen. Why, isn't that curious? "What is?" Miss Hinkle simpered. "Someone giving the name of Helen has just been calling for your husband here." "But we don't know anyone by the name of Helen." Lavinia stopped and began to look at me through narrowed lids, much as she had done in the library the evening before. And then from different parts of the room other manipulators began to report. Every plagued one of those 5 Ouija boards was calling me by name. I felt my ears grow crimson, purple, maroon. My wife was looking at me as though I were some peculiar insect. The squeak of Ouija boards and the murmur of conversation rose louder and louder, and then I felt my face twitch in the spasm of that idiotic grin. I tried to straighten my wretched features into their usual semblance of humanity. I tried and, "Doesn't he look sly?" said Miss Hinkle. And then I got up and fled from the room. I do not know how that party ended. I do not want to know. I went straight upstairs, and undressed and crawled into bed, and lay there in the burning dark while the last guest gurgled in the hall below about the wonderful evening she had spent. I lay there while the front door shut after her, and Lavinia's steps came up the stairs and past the door to the guest room beyond. And then after a couple of centuries elapsed, the clock struck 3 and I dozed off to sleep, At the breakfast table the next morning there was no sign of my wife. I concluded she was sleeping late, but Gladolia, upon being questioned, only shook her head, muttered something, and turned the whites of her eyes up to the ceiling. I was glad when the meal was over and hurried to the library for another try at that story. I had hardly seated myself at the desk when there came a tap at the door and a white slip of paper slid under it. I unfolded it and read, "Dear John, I am going back to my grandmother. My lawyer will communicate with you later." "Oh," I cried. "Oh, I wish I was dead." "And that's exactly what you ought to be," said that horrible voice from the other end of the room. I sat up abruptly. I had sunk into a chair under the blow of the letter, then I dropped back again and my hair rose in a thick prickle on the top of my head. Coming majestically across the floor towards me was a highly polished pair of thick-laced shoes. I stared at them in a sort of dreadful fascination, and then something about their gait attracted my attention and I recognized them. "See here," I said sternly. "What do you mean by appearing here like this?" "I can't help it," said the voice, which seemed to come from a point about 5.5 feet above the shoes. I raised my eyes and presently distinguished her round protruding mouth. "Why can't you? A nice way to act, to walk in sections. If you'll give me time," said the mouth in an exasperated voice, "I assure you the rest of me will presently arrive." "But what's the matter with you? You never acted this way before." She seemed stung to make a violent effort, for a portion of a fishy eye and the end of her nose popped into view with a suddenness that made me jump. "It's all your fault." She glared at me, while part of her hair and her plaid skirt began slowly to take form. "My fault? Of course. How can you keep a lady up working all night and then expect her to retain all her faculties the next day? I'm just too tired to materialize." "Then why did you bother?" "Because I was sent to ask when your wife is going to get rid of that Ouija board." "How should I know? I wish to heaven I'd never seen you," I cried. "Look what you've done. You've lost me my wife, you've lost me my home and happiness, you've, Mr. O'Hallock came from the hall outside. "Mr. O'Hallock, I's gwine to quit. I don't like no hoodoos." And the steps retreated. You've lost me my cook." "I didn't come here to be abused," said the ghost coldly. I, and then the door opened and Lavinia entered. She wore the brown hat and coat she usually travels in and carried a suitcase which she set down on the floor. That suitcase had an air of solid finality about it, and its lock leered at me brassily. I leaped from my chair with unaccustomed agility and sprang in front of my wife. I must conceal that awful phantom from her, at any risk. She did not look at me, or, thank heaven, behind me, but fixed her injured gaze upon the waste-basket, as if to wrest dark secrets from it. "I have come to tell you that I am leaving," she staccatoed. "Oh, yes, yes," I agreed, flapping my arms about to attract attention from the corner. "That's fine, great. So you want me to go, Do you? She demanded. Sure, yes, right away. Change of air will do you good. I'll join you presently. If only she would go till Helen could depart. I'd have the devil of a time explaining afterward, of course, but anything would be better than to have Lavinia see a ghost. Why, that sensitive little woman couldn't bear to have a mouse say boo at her, and what would she say to a ghost in her own living room? Lavinia cast a cold eye upon me. You are acting very queerly, she sniffed. You are concealing something from me. Just then the door opened and Gladolia called, Miss Horlock. Miss Horlock. I've come to tell you I.S.E. done left this place. My wife turned her head a moment. But why, Gladolia? I ain't staying round no place long with dem Ouija board contraptions. I.S.E. scared of hoodoos. I's done gone, I is. Is that all you've got to complain about? Lavinia inquired. Yes, All right, then. Go back to the kitchen. You can use the board for kindling wood. Who? Me touch that teeing. No, not this nigger. I'll be the coon to burn it, I shouted. I'll be glad to burn it. Gladolia's heavy steps moved off kitchenward. Then my Lavinia turned waspishly to me again. John, there's not a bit of use trying to deceive me. What is it you are trying to conceal from me? Who? Me. Oh, no, I lied elaborately, looking around to see if that drat ghost was concealed enough. She was so big, and I'm rather a smallish man. But that was a bad move on my part. John, Lavinia demanded like a ward boss, you are hiding somebody in here. Who is it? I only waved denial and gurgled in my throat. She went on, it's bad enough to have you flirt over the Ouija board with that hussy. Oh, the affair was quite above board, I assure you, my love. I cried, leaping lithely about to keep her from focusing her gaze behind me. She thrust me back with sudden muscle. I will see who's behind you. Where is that Helen? Me. I'm Helen, came from the ghost. Lavinia looked at that apparition, that owl-eyed phantom, in plaid skirt and stiff shirtwaist, with hair skewed back and no powder on her nose. I threw a protecting husbandly arm about her to catch her when she should faint. But she didn't swoon. A broad, satisfied smile spread over her face. I thought you were Helen of Troy, she murmured. I used to be Helen of Troy, New York, said the ghost. And now I'll be moving along, if you'll excuse me. See you later. With that she telescoped briskly, till we saw only a hand waving farewell. My Lavinia fell forgivingly into my arms. I kissed her once or twice fervently, and then I shoved her aside, for I felt a sudden strong desire to write. The sheets of paper on my desk spread invitingly before me. I've got the bulliest plot for a ghost story, I cried. The Lady and the Ghost by Rose Cecil O'Neill from the Cosmopolitan magazine. By permission of John Brisbane Walker and Rose O'Neill. Top The Lady and the Ghost by Rose Cecil O'Neill. It was some moments before the lady became rationally convinced that there was something occurring in the corner of the room, and then the actual nature of the thing was still far from clear. To put it as mildly as possible, she murmured, "The thing verges upon the uncanny," and, leaning forward upon her silken knees, she attended upon the phenomenon. At first it had seemed like some faint and unexplained atmospheric derangement, occasioned, apparently, neither by an opened window nor by a door. Some papers fluttered to the floor, the fringes of the hangings softly waved, and, indeed, it would still have been easy to dismiss the matter as the effect of a vagrant draught had not the state of things suddenly grown unmistakably unusual. All the air of the room, it then appeared, rushed even with violence to the point, and there underwent what impressed her as an aerial convulsion, in the very midst and wellspring of which, so great was the confusion, there seemed to appear at intervals almost the semblance of a shape. The silence of the room was disturbed by a book that flew open with fluttering leaves, the noise of a vase of violets blown over, from which the perfumed water dripped to the floor, and soft touchings all around as of a breeze passing through a chamber full of trifles. The ringlets of the lady's hair were swept forward toward the corner upon which her gaze was fixed, and in which the conditions had now grown so tense with imminent occurrence and so rent with some inconceivable throe that she involuntarily rose, and, stepping forward against the pressure of her petticoats which were blown about her ankles, she impatiently thrust her hand into the. She was immediately aware that another hand had received it, though with a far from substantial envelopment, and for another moment what she saw before her trembled between something and nothing. Then from the precarious situation there slowly emerged into dubious view the shape of a young man dressed in evening clothes, over which was flung a mantle of voluminous folds such as is worn by ghosts of fashion. "The very deuce was in it," he complained. "I thought I should never materialize." She flung herself into her chair, confounded, yet, even in the shock of the emergency, true to herself, she did not fail to smooth her ruffled locks. Her visitor had been scanning his person in a dissatisfied way, and with some vexation he now ejaculated, "Beg your pardon, my dear, but are my feet on the floor, or where in thunder are they?" It was with a tone of reassurance that she confessed that his patent leathers were the trivial matter of 2 or 3 inches from the rug. Whereupon, with still another effort, he brought himself down until his feet rested decently upon the floor. It was only when he walked about to examine the bric-a-brac that a suspicious lightness was discernible in his tread. When he had composed himself by the survey, effecting it with an air of great insouciance, which, however, failed to conceal the fact that his heart was beating somewhat wildly, he approached the lady. "Well, here we are again, my love," he cried, and devoured her hands with ghostly kisses. "It seems an eternity that I've been struggling back to you through the outer void and what not. Sometimes, I confess I all but despaired. Life is not, I assure you, all beer and skittles for the disembodied." He drew a long breath, and his gaze upon her and the entire chamber seemed to envelop all and cherish it. Little room, And so you are thus. Do you know, he continued, with vivacity, I have wondered about it in the grave, and I could hardly sleep for this place unpenetrated. Hi-ho! What a lot of things we leave undone. I dashed this off at the time, the literary passion strong in me, thus, now, when all is done, and I lie so low, I cannot sleep for this, my only care, for though of that dim place I could not know, that where my heart was fain I did not go, nor saw you musing there. Well, well, these things irk a ghost so. Naturally, as soon as possible I made my way back, to be satisfied that you were still mine. He bent a piercing look upon her. I observe by the calendar on your writing table that some years have elapsed since since I expired, he added, with a faint blush. It appears that the matter of their dissolution is, in conversation, rather kept in the background by well-bred ghosts. Hi-ho! How time does fly! You'll be joining me soon, my dear. She drew herself splendidly up, and he was aware of her beauty in the full of its tenacious excellence, of the delicate insolence of life looking upon death, of the fact that she had forgotten him. He rose, and confronted this, his trembling hands thrust into his pockets, then turned away to hide the dismay of his countenance. He was, however, a spook of considerable spirit, and in a jiffy he met the occasion. To her blank, indignant gaze he drew a card from his case, and, taking a pencil from the secretary, wrote, beneath the name, Quiet to the breast wheresoe'er it be, that gave an hour's rest to the heart of me. Quiet to the breast till it lieth dead, and the heart be clay where I visited. Quiet to the breast, though forgetting quite the guest it sheltered once, to the heart, good night. Handing her the card he bowed, and, through force of habit, turned to the door, forgetting that his ghostly pressure would not turn the knob. As the door did not open, with a sigh of recollection for his spiritual condition, he prepared to disappear, casting one last look at the faithless lady. She was still looking at the card in her hand, and the tears ran down her face. She has remembered, he reflected, how courteous. For a moment it seemed he could contain his disappointment, discreetly removing himself now at what he felt was the vanishing point, with the customary reticence of the dead, but feeling overcame him. In an instant he had her in his arms, and was pouring out his love, his reproaches, the story of his longing, his doubts, his discontent, and his desperate journey back to earth for a sight of her. And, ah, cried he, picture my agony at finding that you had forgotten. And yet I surmised it in the gloom. I divined it by my restlessness and my despair. Perhaps some lines that occurred to me will suggest the thing to you. You recall my old knack for versification. Where the grasses weep o'er his darkling bed, and the glow-worms creep, lies the weary head of one laid deep, who cannot sleep, the unremembered dead. He took a chair beside her, and spoke of their old love for each other, of his fealty through all transmutations, incidentally of her beauty, of her cruelty, of the light of her face which had illumined his darksome way to her, and of a lot of other things, and the lady bowed her head, and wept. The hours of the night passed thus, the moon waned, and a pallor began to tinge the dusky cheek of the east, but the eloquence of the visitor still flowed on, and the lady had his misty hands clasped to her reawakened bosom. At last a suspicion of rosiness touched the curtain. He abruptly rose. "I cannot hold out against the morning," he said, "it is time all good ghosts were in bed." But she threw herself on her knees before him, clasping his ethereal waist with a despairing embrace. "Oh, do not leave me," she cried, "or my love will kill me." He bent eagerly above her. "Say it again, convince me." "I love you," she cried, again and again and again, with such an anguish of sincerity as would convince the most skeptical spook that ever revisited the glimpses of the moon. "You will forget again," he said. "I shall never forget," she cried. "My life will henceforth be one continual remembrance of you, one long act of devotion to your memory, one oblation, one unceasing penitence, one agony of waiting." He lifted her face, and saw that it was true. "Well," said he, gracefully wrapping his cloak about him, "well, now I shall have a little peace." He kissed her, with a certain jaunty grace, upon her hair, and prepared to dissolve, while he lightly tapped a tattoo upon his leg with the dove-colored gloves he carried. "Goodbye, my dear," he said, "henceforth I shall sleep o' nights, my heart is quite at rest." "But mine is breaking," she wailed, madly trying once more to clasp his vanishing form. He threw her a kiss from his misty fingertips, and all that remained with her, besides her broken heart, was a faint disturbance of the air. Transcriber's notes, page 25, possible typo, but left it as the original. And contented himself, as a rule, with creeping about the passages in list slippers. Page 25, arquebus, printer typo corrected to arquebus. Page 231, setting, printer typo corrected to sitting. Page 255, missing word have inserted to, but now I'll none of you, for you've played with me. Page 304, potential typo. Walking round and round the graveyard lie a 6 days race for the belt at Madison Square. Page 325, impatient, typo corrected to impatient. Although impatient is a valid word, it is incorrectly used in this instance. Page 345, is, printer typo corrected to in. Page 408, possible typo, but left it as in the original. Then the affection spread to her knees and gradually extended upward. Several instances of variant spelling of recipe and recipe. Left as in the original. From a Southern Porch by Dorothy Scarborough, a book of whimsy. The author does not preach the lost art of loafing. No. Nothing so direct as preaching. She merely loafs, consistently, restfully, delightfully, but with an almost fatal hypnotic persuasiveness. She is a sort of stationary Pied Piper, alluring the unwary reader to her sun-flecked porch, to watch with her the queer procession of created things go by, from lovers and ghosts to lizards and toads. Under the spell, Convinced that loafing is better than doing, the reader stays and chuckles over the quiet humor and quaint fancies. He gets away finally. All delightful experiences must end in this work-a-day world, still chuckling, but with a renewed sense of life and life's values. G. P. Putnam's Sons, New York, London. The Kiltartan Poetry Book. Prose translations from the Irish by Lady Gregory, author of Irish folk history plays, 7 short plays, Our Irish Theatre, etc. Certainly no single individual has done more than Lady Gregory to revive the Irish literature, and to bring again to light the brave old legends, the old heroic poems. From her childhood, the author has studied this ancient language, and has collected most of her material from close association with the peasants who have inherited these poems and tales. G. P. Putnam's Sons, New York, London. ******* End of the Project Gutenberg ebook Humorous Ghost Stories ******* Updated editions will replace the previous one, the old editions will be renamed. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works, so the Foundation, and you, can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the general terms of use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol concept and trademark. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark, and may not be used if you charge for an ebook, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this ebook, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this ebook for nearly any purpose, such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances and research. Project Gutenberg ebooks may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with ebooks not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Start. Full license. The full Project Gutenberg license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work to protect the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol mission of promoting the free distribution of electronic works. By using or distributing this work, or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg, you agree to comply with all the terms of the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license available with this file or online at www.gutenberg.org/license. Section 1. General Terms of Use and Redistributing Project Gutenberg Trademark Symbol Electronic Works 1.0. By reading or using any part of this Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work, you indicate that you have read, understand, agree to and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property, trademark/copyright, agreement. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or destroy all copies of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works in your possession. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work and you do not agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in paragraph 1.e.8. 1.b Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark. It may only be used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are a few things that you can do with most Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1.c below. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works if you follow the terms of this agreement and help preserve free future access to Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works. See paragraph 1.e below. 1.c. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the Foundation or PGLAF, owns a compilation copyright in the collection of Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic works. Nearly all the individual works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying or creating derivative works based on the work as long as all references to Project Gutenberg are removed. Of course, we hope that you will support the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol mission of promoting free access to electronic works by freely sharing Project Gutenberg trademark symbol works in compliance with the terms of this agreement for keeping the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol name associated with the work. You can easily comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the same format with its attached full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license when you share it without charge with others. 1.d. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern what you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. If you are outside the United States, check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing or creating derivative works based on this work or any other Project Gutenberg trademark symbol work. The Foundation makes no representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. 1.e Unless you have removed all references to Project Gutenberg. 1.e.1. The following sentence, with active links to, or other immediate access to, the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license must appear prominently whenever any copy of a Project Gutenberg trademark symbol work, any work on which the phrase Project Gutenberg appears, or with which the phrase Project Gutenberg is associated, is accessed, displayed, performed, viewed, copied or distributed. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this ebook or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. 1.e.2 If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work is derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder, the work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 or obtain permission for the use of the work and the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1.e.8 or 1.e.9. 1.e.3 If an individual Project Gutenberg trademark symbol electronic work is posted with the permission of the copyright holder, your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1.e.1 through 1.e.7 and any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. Additional terms will be linked to the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license for all works posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. 1.e.4 Do not unlink or detach or remove the full Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this work or any other work associated with Project Gutenberg trademark symbol. 1.e.5 Do not copy, display, perform, distribute or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1.e.1 with active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg trademark symbol license. 1.e.6 You may convert